studio tonight Mr. Arthur Scargill, the president of the National Union of Mine Workers. He's the man who over the years has campaigned and gone close to strikes for better pay for the miners and for fewer pit closures. So for him tonight, it is all happening. Mr. Scargill, given that many of your union officials want to have a national ballot over the strikes, have you any intention of recalling your national executive before its normal meeting on April the 12th?
What I intend to do is to carry out the instructions of the National Executive Committee, and that decision was unanimous at its last meeting, and that is to give consent to those areas that are currently taking strike action to have that action declared official, and of course to recognise that we still have national action in progress. To also reaffirm that it's the union's total opposition to pit closures and the determination of Mr McGregor and the Coal Board to impose those closures upon us that has brought us into this position. And that's the reason that we're now facing probably the greatest crisis since 1974.
Inside your union?
No, inside the industry and inside the nation, I would have thought.
Now, what about those union officials in the many regions who have said that they would like to have a national ballot? There are regions which have balloted their own members. Do you think they're now part of an anti-union group?
I think there's always been various points of view inside the National Union of Mine Workers, and indeed inside any trade union. But there is one voice of total unity, and that is opposition to pit closures and the programme put forward by Mr McGregor. And I think we should remember that it was Mr McGregor's statement of his intention to close over 20 pits and to make over 20,000 men redundant that sparked off the present controversy. And when one examines the stewardship of Mr McGregor in the first 6 months, it really is devastating. It's cost the British taxpayers over £500 million so far as a consequence of his bulldozing tactics and attempt to steamroller the mining industry into a pit closure programme. And that's what's causing the dispute and the problem in the mining industry today.
Now, you say there's one voice, but aren't there two voices and perhaps many more? I mean, what do you say to the miners who have voted to go on working and who wish to go on working? You gave them a chance to vote. Why don't you let them adhere to their own vote?
Well, let me first of all give it clear expression. The National Executive Committee were not asked for any rights to vote in individual areas at all. What we were asked to do was to give authority and permission to areas who wanted to take industrial action, and that was given unanimously. And that's the position of the National Executive Committee today. As far as we are concerned, we are aware that every area of the NUM, as far as I'm told anyway, have said that their members should not cross picket lines. And traditionally, of course, our members have been involved in actions in previous years and said to members, look, will you support us in this action? And I find it absolutely astonishing in 1984 that we have to have 10,000 police in the Nottinghamshire and Midlands areas, something like a paramilitary state. Indeed, if this was happening in Poland, I've no doubt that it would be splashed all over the front pages of national newspapers and appear on ITV and BBC as well.
Nevertheless, in 38 pits consistently over the past 10 days, men have gone to work against your views. Now, the media are not bribing them to go into work. The police are not forcing them to work. Why are they crossing your picket line?
Well, with respect, what the media are doing is everything in their power to try and divide the National Union of Mine Workers, to try and drive divisions into that organisation. As far as we are concerned, we make it absolutely clear that there is already national action. And this seems to escape the attention of the national media for some reason. We've had a national overtime ban for about 23 weeks. It's cost the National Coal Board over 10 million tonnes of lost production and well over £400 million in lost revenue. That's been devastatingly successful. But at the same time, it was Mr McGregor's decision to close at least at 20 pits and make redundant over 20,000 men that sparked the current controversy. And I must make the point that we in Britain do produce the cheapest deep mine coal in the world. And it's a travesty that we're seeing pits threatened with closure. If we were to receive the same state aid as is given in the communist bloc or is given in Western coal-producing nations, then our industry would be making for the British taxpayer today about £2,300 million profit.
Well, now, there are a number of points that you make there, Mr Scargill. First of all, in fact, deep mine coal in the United States and Australia is cheaper than deep mine coal here. And equally, in Europe, where, of course, quite agree, there are subsidies to the French, Belgian and German mines. But, of course, those are countries which don't have oil, which you don't produce in your equation. But what about the investment in future mines in this country? Could you compare that with Germany, France or Belgium?
Oh, yes, you could compare all of those things, but let me first
Is
of all...
it not twice as much as in Germany and 20 times as much as in France?
Well, let me first of all correct something that you've said. It's not true that deep mine coal in the United States and Australia is cheaper than Britain. Indeed, if you take the subsidies into account in the United States of America, their coal is much more expensive from deep mining, and I'm not talking about...
Well, they'd be
open
surprised to hear that, however.
Well, of course, they may be surprised to hear that, but it's a fact of life, and if you take into account the delivered price, it's considerably higher.
Well, wait a
When we
moment.
talk about the investment in this industry in Britain, of course we're having investment into Britain, but it's costing the mining industry an enormous amount of money. People in the media generally talk about the money given to the mining industry. It's just not true. We're paying up to 17% for the money that we are being loaned by central government. And it's costing the mining industry £2.2 million a day in repayments to the government in order that our industry can function. So that before we pay a penny wages, before we make a penny profit, we have to pay £2.2 million to the government. That can't be right.
Well, how many pits closed in Britain after your last mining strike in 1973-74?
Oh, the number of pits that closed after 1973-4, on average, were about 10 or 12 per year.
18 in the first year, surely,
Yes.
and 10 in the second.
Yes, but I'm talking about on average,
Yes,
between the 9 years.
I understand that.
And you see, the position is that in the plan for coal, which was adopted in 1974 and incidentally approved by the Conservative government prior to the 1979 election, they did agree to honour that and to put it into operation. The plan for coal did not envisage pit closures. It only envisaged closures due to exhaustion, something which we naturally accept. But the closure programme now taking place is not only closing pits which have got vast reserves of coal in them, but even closing units which are tremendously economic. We've just closed a coking plant in South Wales, which was making about £1 million to £1.5 million profit per year. That really is nonsense, even in economic terms.
What was the increase in productivity in the plan for coal in 1974 per annum?
Oh, the increase in the productivity rate has gone on.
No.
No, with respect, no, it's gone on from 1974, on average, by about 4 or 5%. But that's not been due to the incentive bonus scheme. It's been due to the innovation of new technology, something which we predicted and something which the Bradford Technology Group predicted in a major report, which I'm sure you're aware has had very wide coverage indeed. So that was the reason for the productivity increases.
Mr. Scargill, the productivity was very slow to come through, and you didn't deliver it to the Labour government, even when Mr. Benn was, in fact, Secretary for Energy.
I'm sorry, but we did deliver the productivity increases. What happened was this. The reason that productivity in the mining industry over many years was, in fact, artificially held down was because of an appalling lack of investment by various governments. In fact, if you look through the 60s, over 500 pits were closed, and around 500,000 miners lost their jobs and were sacrificed on the altar of so-called cheap Middle East oil. That policy was as daft as this policy is today. We are saying, remember the mistakes that you made. Remember the fact that it cost the British taxpayers about £20,000 million more than it would have done to rely on British coal. Instead, they decided to rely upon imported oil. And today, there is no difference. We're still importing oil, incidentally, about 4 million tonnes of it, costing 30% more than British coal to generate electrical power. And if we changed that policy and began to develop and expand the mining industry and open new pits, then this industry could not only prove in the future years that it could produce the coal necessary, but at the same time could export coal all over the world.
Are there not pits now coming on stream as a result of the taxpayers' investment through the government, which will produce 24 metric million tonnes a year by 1987? Is that not some proof of the investment which has gone into your industry? And if you're worried about alternative fuels, what about socialist France, where communists sit in the government, where 40% of the energy requirements are now provided by nuclear energy, and it will be 60% by 1990.
You're talking, of course, about the French mining industry, where the chairman of the National Coal Board there resigned in disgust at the government's policy decision, and I agree with him totally. Of course,
it is a socialist government.
Well, I don't care what sort of government it is, whether it's Labour or Tory here or Socialist there. If it's wrong, it's wrong. And it happens to be wrong in France, and it happens to be wrong here. Yes, it's perfectly true that we've got investment in the mining industry. Incidentally, the Selby coalfield was first proposed by Arthur Scargill, not the National Coal Board. They replied by saying there was no coal there. That sort of policy is now coming to fruition. The tragedy is, it's not additional capacity. The Coal Board regarded it as replacement capacity. That's the major difference between the Coal Board and ourselves. If it was additional capacity, Britain would now be moving to produce 200 million tonnes of coal per year instead of moving towards producing 100 million tonnes.
But you're talking about cheap coal. And you're quite right, it is the Selby field which will be producing the cheapest coal, won't it?
Yes, but you can't take an industry and say, well, one unit's cheaper than another, so we close one down. We've got a mining industry as a whole, and you can't destroy communities. Are you aware, for example, that it costs over twice as much to close pits and to sack miners as to keep them open?
That was rejected by the House of Commons Energy Committee, on which members of all parties sat.
I'm sorry, the figures have never, ever been really disputed because they're indisputable. The fact is it will cost £4,300 million to cause redundancy in pit closures. It will only cost £2,000 million in the way of subsidies to keep them open. It makes economic sense to do that. And if we can give the farmers of Britain very substantial subsidies, there's no reason why we, in common with other mining industries, give our miners the same help.